The hearing will come to order. Our Republican colleagues are caucusing, and we will begin. I know our colleague from Delaware, Mr. Castle, is on the way, but the unexpected traffic problems have caused the problem. This hearing was called. We haven't been doing much in the lame duck session, but we thought this is a topic that was, frankly, not a partisan or terribly controversial one in a lot of ways. As I understand it, the Securities and Exchange Commission would have the power to do what we are talking about today, which was to raise the level on Regulation A. I know people keep talking about it as Reg A, but that led some people to think that there would be Caribbean music and dancing, and I didn't want to attract the wrong, not the wrong, but a different crowd to this particular hearing. My legislation on the legalization of marijuana will be heard in another committee, so I did want to keep the distinction clear. Although both of these have a certain support in Northern California. The question is whether or not we should be urging, and our colleague from Delaware has been able to join us, and we appreciate it. The question is whether we should be urging the SEC, as a practical matter, to increase this limit. The argument clearly is that it is helpful for capital formation for smaller companies, and in fact is no detraction from a reasonable regulatory scheme. We invited some witnesses, and we worked with the gentleman from California, Ms. Escher, who is here, who's a major proponent of this. And we did not specifically invite people we knew would be opposed, but we haven't heard from people who are. But let me make clear the record stays open if there are groups. And I know that sometimes when we deal with questions, for instance, on the reach of Sarbanes-Oxley, there are various groups representing investors or pension funds who express concerns. We've heard of none in this case, but this hearing may elicit some, and we, of course, will be open. The hearing record will be open if there are any who would like to exercise different views. I do have, where's that paper? Two statements I wanted to mention now. One, the National Venture Capital Association has offered a statement in support of this, arguing that it will enable more small companies to attract capital. And if there is no objection, and it does not appear to be any, that will be put into the record. And without objection, the record will stay open for any further comments that people might have on this proposal. I should note also that it was Speaker Pelosi who first called this to my attention. Earlier in the year, we were a little busy with a couple other matters people may remember, but it is something that the Speaker has taken a great interest in because of her interest in job creation. So we are glad finally to have this hearing. It may be in the next Congress that legislation could happen. It may also be the SEC might be persuaded by some of what they hear today to do this. I finally will apologize for the fact that at 10:25 I will be leaving and turning the hearing over to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Moore, because I will be required to attend the meeting of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee to make the case as to why I should remain the ranking member, or not remain, but return to the position I once had of ranking member. With that, I will recognize our colleague from Delaware.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have an opening statement. I think we should get right to our witnesses with the time limitations, except to welcome Ann Escher and the other witnesses who are going to testify today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, wanted to make a 2-minute statement.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say a couple of points about this issue that is of some interest to me, and I just wanted to make, for the record, a couple of points that certainly I think should be made regarding the increase of the offering limit under the SEC regulations. I think it's very important that the proposed increase from $5 million to $30 million, though substantial, could indeed yield positive results if implemented appropriately, because I think that this could help with job creation. And as you know, on this committee, I have been very, very, very much at the forefront of trying to appropriate our policy to place job creation at the forefront. And so I think that there is an advantage to this as job creation. And the facilitated development of new technologies and products could also result from such an increase. We've seen the dollar limit increase incrementally 5 times from its original level of $100,000 to the current level of $5 million, which was established in 1980. Since 30 years have now passed, the effects of inflation alone could be argued as reason to increase the offering limit, and such an increase could enable smaller companies, small businesses, many of whom are backed by venture capital firms, more timely access to funding. And again, these are the areas where jobs are created, our small businesses, and I think that this will be certainly helpful. So I'm certainly interested in hearing from my colleague, Ms. Eshoo. I know of her great interest in this issue in terms of what her opinions are on terms of what increase should be made to the offering, if any. Certainly beyond any numerical increase in the limit, Congress should also consider the expected implementation by the SEC and whether such an increase would either be mandated or simply authorized. Some important points I wanted to make. I look forward to Ms. Eshoo. I certainly respect her opinion on these areas. It would be nice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New York, Ms. Maloney, is recognized for 2 minutes.
First of all, I want to welcome my good friend and colleague, Anna Eshoo, and I look very much forward to her testimony, so I'll be very, very brief. The issue of giving smaller companies the tools and resources they need to raise capital and become the driving force of our economy is really critical for economic recovery. So I think that this hearing is very timely and important as it pertains to job creation. And I look forward to her testimony about the benefits of raising the offering limit under Regulation A, as well as whether it will increase the use of the exemption for small issuers. So I welcome her. I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
And our colleague from California is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for inviting me to testify today to talk about this proposal to increase the offering limit under SEC Regulation A, which was, as you know, enacted during the Great Depression to facilitate the flow of capital into small businesses. As you know, I represent the innovation capital of our country, Silicon Valley, and we know there if we don't constantly innovate, we stagnate. The larger policy context for raising the Regulation A limit from $5 million to $30 million is to create what we're so desperate for, good jobs. We need to promote capital formation, technological innovation, and job creation, and I think that we can achieve these goals by revitalizing what is essentially a non-working section of the Security Act. So you may all ask, what's the problem? And why should we consider increasing today's limits in Regulation A? The main problem is that hardly anybody uses it. Currently, there's little incentive to support the small initial public offerings under Regulation A. In fact, the current regulations are a disincentive, burdening a $5 million offering with $1 to $2 million in underwriting expenses. So that's a pretty good reason why people aren't using it. At the same time, the threshold for traditional IPO funding has grown out of reach for most small companies, leaving them without the viable alternatives to raise money. 2 firms in my congressional district, the Silicon Valley Bank and Wilson Sonsini, have more than 9,000 private company clients between them, companies that are or will need an infusion of public capital. Under a revised Regulation A, small companies would gain access to capital, and it's a way to test the market to see if there's additional support. Regulation A will allow companies to seek small infusions of funds as they go along, and then investors can demonstrate their confidence with their checkbooks. But without this access to public capital markets, good ideas are really withering on the vine. And the impact of this recession on the venture capital market cannot be understated. It's been devastating. Raising the Regulation A cap from $5 million to $30, I think, is a jobs program, and we should think about it that way. good jobs that are focused on the cutting edge of innovation, creating new products, new markets, additional growth for our economy. And these would be jobs created here in the United States. In considering and whether to raise the limits, it's useful to examine the history. In 1933, Congress set the dollar limit under Regulation A at $100,000. It's been raised several times since then, $300,000 in 1945, $500,000 in 1972, $1.5 million in 1978, $2 million in 1978, and $5 million in 1980. But in 1980, the SEC waited until 1992 to actually adopt the same change in the rule. So it's been some time. In Silicon Valley, companies are seeking capital for the next breakthrough of technologies and finding the available capital, and this is what really gets me, in other parts of the world. We're falling behind as the world's technology leader, and a few simple modifications could make Regulation A an engine for capital formation and economic growth. Congress, of course, must weigh the potential risks to investor protection and the potential benefits. That's our job, all associated with Regulation A. It is a meaningful capital conduit as it was originally intended, and the SEC can and should use its recently invigorated, thanks to your committee and your leadership here, reinvigorated enforcement program to prevent abuses. But make no mistake, there is pent-up demand. The money is available and investors are willing. And there are unnamed ventures today that have the potential to be the future Googles, Genentechs, Facebooks, and eBays. And we can do something to help make this happen. So I think overall this is a modest proposal, but I think it has high potential for capital formation, for technological innovation, and for job creation in our country. And for all these reasons, I urge the committee to give all due consideration to the proposal to raise the cap on Regulation A offerings. And I thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to appear before the committee.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just a brief question. One of the things you mentioned, the bill, what I'm hoping is that in the funding resolution that is about to go through, both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission get the significant increase they've asked for. We give a number of regulatory bodies increased authority, but the FDIC, the Fed, and the Controller, as the new version, are largely self-funded through fees, and the new Consumer Agency will be. But the SEC and the CFTC, which both get significant increased responsibilities over derivatives and other issues, need the extra money. In a small way, though, this would seem to me to contribute, if I'm correct, doing this would conceivably free up some SEC resources. That is, by increasing this level, you would theoretically allow people to, not theoretically, you would allow people to go forward, and the SEC would not have to divert resources. It's not huge, but it would go in the right direction. Would that be accurate?
Well, it seems to me on the face of it that you've just stated the case. It would. It would free up resources and
allow the SEC to concentrate on the broader problems
on other things. And I think too, Mr. Chairman, that when you look at how many IPOs there were in 2005 and you take it to 2009, there is a drastic fall off. So this is a wonderful tool. This is a wonderful tool. It's not government money. This is private sector money that would go into the public capital markets. So it's an important tool. It's not being used. There is a pent-up demand. So I think it's really an important proposal. And we're desperate to create jobs in this country. We know that. No matter where we go, people talk about it. What are we going to do? Here's a way of addressing at least part of it.
Well,
a very important part of it.
And I am in virtually complete agreement. I do say those who are fully familiar with the works of Jonathan Swift might want to refrain from calling this a modest proposal, since his modest proposal was not a great idea, if people remember. It was somewhat sarcastic. But that does not detract from the merits of this. With that, I will recognize the gentleman from Delaware and ask the gentleman from Kansas to assume the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions of the Congresswoman except to thank her for, I thought, a clear statement and advocacy for this. I don't know what the other side is, but you did a good job on the pro side of it.
Thank you.
So we thank you.
It's
I yield back.
lovely to see you, and we're going to miss you here.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you,
deal.
Anna. Thank you.
Okay.
I understand Mr. Castle is finished. You yield back. Thank you, sir. And any other members have questions of Ms. Askew? Yes, Ms. Maloney.
Congresswoman, does the SEC need an act of Congress to raise the exemption, or could they do it by themselves and set the limit?
I believe the SEC can take this on itself, but I mean they have before, and but I think the oversight of the committee is very important as well. You know, and I know that the next panel, especially Mr. Hambrick, can talk about or raise the issue of where there could be potential abuses and you know, the protection of investors. But I do believe that the SEC can take this on themselves.
And how did you arrive at the $30 million number? How was that derived?
Well, it really is, that number was arrived at by the needs of what small companies really need to help get off the ground. In other words, it's a workable number. Is it hard and fast? I don't think so, but I think that that range is very important.
Mm-hmm. And how does Reg A work now? How does it work
It's
now?
not working.
It's not.
No one uses it. That's
No one
the
uses
problem.
But I'm told that 8 companies used it last year.
8 in our whole country.
Yeah.
That says something in and of itself.
Well, okay.
I mean, when I have two firms in my congressional district, as I mentioned, Silicon Valley Bank and Wilson Sonsini, just between the two of them, they have about 9,000 company clients that are looking to make investments. See, so that's why this is collected dust, and the ceiling on it simply doesn't work in the 21st century. Okay. And there is pent-up demand, and we should want to meet that demand.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Any more questions, Mr. Scott? You're done.
Yes.
Sorry. Could you walk us through and give a good example of just how this is a tool for job creation, and specifically how the $30 million in increase would turn over into an increase of jobs, as specifically as you could?
Well, it's a great question, because I think that because we're so desperate for jobs that whatever we do, we want to attach, and this will create jobs. And it seems to be illusory in many instances. It's important to understand how this money works. First of all, the regulation with a new cap would allow companies to seek these small infusions of funds as they go along. Mm-hmm. Then investors would demonstrate their confidence, as I said earlier, with their checkbooks. Now, what happens? Once these dollars are invested, that's when the hiring starts taking place. That's how the companies actually start to grow. And it's important to know that even against the backdrop of an economy where investment funds are scarce, at the high end, in deals of $100 million or more, there's a lot of action. But at the low end, deals of $50 million or less, the traditional IPO capital has really disappeared, and it hasn't come back. And as I said, in 2004, there were 40 IPOs at $50 million or less. In 2005, there were 38 IPOs at $50 million or less. In 2009, there was one. There was one. So clearly, the existing IPO structure is not getting the job done for smaller companies. And those innovative companies, those new companies that we want to be born and grow, as the dollars come in, they keep hiring. They keep hiring. I remember when Eric Schmidt, when I saw him somewhere some years ago, I said, "Eric, what's news? What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going off to this outfit called Google." And I said, "You've got to be kidding." It was the first time I'd heard the word Google. So we need new companies to be born, but these are the ingredients that help them grow. And at this lower level of investment, nothing is going on. Essentially, the IPO market is, I don't want to use the word dead, but in 2009, that says something.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I think what you're saying in terms of almost any direct infusion of capital, the lead consequence has to be job creation, and it certainly does. Would you not agree that the argument that the increase in this $30 million would pose a potential risk to investors, that argument is kind of weak, and that the upside is and the benefit is this job creation that would have created? Is that the best way we can respond to the argument that some people might feel that there may be a risk to investors in this?
Well, I think it's important for both the SEC and for Congress to examine what the risks could be. I think that's a very important thing to do. Here we are at the end of 2010. We know what the cost of risk is in this country. People in the country have paid a great price for risks that have been taken. So I think that Mr. Hambrecht can better answer that. I think he knows in a broad and deep way what the risks could be and what areas need to be examined. But I have no doubt that if this is structured correctly with the right oversight, and this committee has built in a lot of new enforcement mechanisms, that this can be carried out very well without abuses and rebuild the IPO market in our country, which, as I said, there's a pent-up demand for this, and I think that we can do something about it. And America will win.
Well, I agree with you, Ms. Escher. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your
testimony.
Ms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Lovely to be with you.
And if the next, can we have the next panel of witnesses please seated? Thank you for being here today for this committee hearing. And we'll ask each of the witnesses, please, to give their statement if they have a statement to make. We'll start with Mr. Hambrecht, founder and chairman and chief executive officer of Hambrecht & Company. Sir, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is your mic on, sir?
I beg your pardon?
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present our proposals to hopefully how shall I put it, rebuild an IPO market that has basically been moribund for the past decade. I think rather than read my remarks, I have submitted our answers to the questions that were directed to us from the committee. If I may, I would like to highlight a few of the points.
Please do.
And then hopefully, if you have any questions, be happy to deal with them.
Yes, sir.
First of all, the jobs question, which is really why we're all here. I think there's significant data out there that very much shows that the major engine of job creation for the past 4 or 5 decades in this country has come from new entrepreneurial companies. The National Venture Capital Association has estimated that 90% of job creation has come from these companies. Living and working in Silicon Valley, it's so obvious that even the Hewlett-Packards and the Intels are really young companies. They've started in our generation, and they've grown tremendously. And it continues to happen. There are still some great young companies that come along. In our testimony, we pointed out 3 examples. Google, of course, is the obvious one. Ms. Esho brought it up. But, you know, when they went public 5 years ago, they had employment of 1,628 employees. Today, their employment is 19,800 employees. Now, it's easy to say, well, Google is a very unusual company, and it is, but there are countless examples of it. Another one, Salesforce, which came public really, I guess, just a year or so before Google. They had 500 employees. They now have 4,000. But the one I do want to bring up, because I think it's more applicable to the world we're talking about, is Adobe Systems. They went public in 1986, I beg your pardon, for $5.5 million, a tiny little offering. At that time, they had 49 employees. Today, they have 8,600 employees. And that's the kind of company we're worrying about. The Googles and the Salesforces of the world will attract underwriters and will be able to go into the public market. But it's the small software company like an Adobe that does not have access to the public market. Representative Eshoo, I think, described the IPO market for under $50 million better than I could. We have a chart in our testimony that shows it. It's basically a number of offerings. It's 3% of all public offerings in the past decade. And so clearly it just isn't working for small companies. To move to the Regulation A exemption, the reason we focused on it is that, first of all, it is part of the regulatory landscape. It was written into the 33 Act. It worked pretty well until actually 1996. And in 1996, under the Securities Markets Act that was passed then, it granted a blue sky exemption to any company that was listed on an exchange. And what this did is it took the burden away of having to file with 48 different state regulators, a very expensive, very time-consuming process. And it streamlined the IPO process. But the problem is you really have to have an offering of somewhere between $20 and $30 million to qualify to list on any of the exchanges, including NASDAQ. So to get the blue sky exemption, you have to have an offering of $20 million or more. And this is what basically drove the Regulation A exemption into just an unworkable position. When you look at it, it has some advantages. It's basically a simplified S-1 registration statement. For those of you who have read prospectuses, the way to describe it, it leaves the last 50 pages out, which are largely schedules, backup data that apply to big companies, but really, for the most part, don't really apply to smaller companies. Secondly, it allows you to test the market. It allows you to go out and talk to investors to see if they're interested before you commit to the expense of hundreds of thousands of dollars, or in an S-1 process, millions of dollars, You can find out whether you have a good chance of basically succeeding. This is particularly important now because since 2007, over 30% of the S1 filings have been withdrawn. They've been unsuccessful. So this was a tremendous burden on the companies that tried to do the deals. And thirdly,
if you can, please wind up your testimony. Your time has expired, but
okay,
please.
Okay, let me just close then
Sure,
with one set of data that I'd ask you to look at. This is the data on M&A transactions versus IPO transactions. We have it in our testimony. Effectively, what you'll see is that the M&A number is a minimum of 10 times what the IPO volume is. And as a result, virtually every M&A transaction results in job loss. It's a consolidation of two companies, and you have overlap of overhead, and people lose jobs. And that's what's happening in Silicon Valley today. That's the exit route people are taking because the IPO possibility is not there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Hambrecht. And next, Mr. Limpress, if you would please make your opening statement, and your Assistant General Counsel and Practice Head for SVB Financial Group. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just,
well,
there we go.
There you go.
Okay. As mentioned, I'm here with SVB Financial Group and its subsidiary Silicon Valley Bank. One of the things unusual about SVB is that we have an unusually deep connection with emerging growth companies, not only in Silicon Valley, but throughout the nation and increasingly throughout the world. Our platform gives us insight into both debt and equity funding channels. Through our subsidiary bank, Silicon Valley Bank, we are the premier provider of financial services for companies in the technology, life science, venture capital, and premium wine industries. We serve more than 13,000 client companies through 26 U.S. and 5 international offices. And we provide banking services for approximately half the venture-backed technology companies in the country today. In addition to our core banking service, SVB, the holding company, also sponsors or has sponsored venture capital funds through our SVB Capital Division and made investments in certain third-party venture funds. One of the things we do is a survey of startup businesses annually. In our Startup Outlook 2010 survey, executives for early-stage growth companies cited as their #1 concern access to capital. So that is their biggest challenge going forward. This is an accurate statement in many ways. Both debt and equity to raise capital exist, but nearly all funding channels are currently under stress. You've heard some of the statistics about that already. Revising Regulation A could fill a need. The impetus behind the creation of Regulation A was a very good one. Unfortunately, in recent years, as you've been hearing, Regulation A has not proved to be a useful capital-raising vehicle for small issuers. It was used only a total of 78 times during the 10-year period between 1995 and 2004. An average of 8 filings a year with a maximum amount of $5 million each really proves the irrelevance of Regulation A in today's economy. It's simply not a viable vehicle as currently structured. The proposed revision of Regulation A strikes a better balance. If Regulation A is to become effective, the offering size will have to be raised. And $30 million seems appropriate, seems an appropriate limit to increase Regulation A offerings. In our view, actually, $50 million would make the Regulation A offerings more useful to companies engaged in capital-intensive sectors. And in the innovation economy, there are some very good examples of these capital-intensive companies. For example, clean energy companies now require substantial capital at relatively early stages in order to establish that a new technology is commercially feasible. Also like to stress that many new products, new technologies are developed and implemented by emerging companies. High-growth small companies are more nimble, more entrepreneurial, and less invested in the status quo than larger companies as a general rule. Thus, it is the emerging company that often implements improvements and disruptive technologies that help revolutionize the way we work and live. And that is truly where much of the job growth comes from in America today. I know the committee asked 6 specific questions, and I look forward to answering them in more detail as we have in the record. But I do want to stress a couple of things. You asked specifically about drawbacks to raising the limit under Regulation A. I think it has to be noted that smaller companies do tend to present different financial risks than bigger companies. They have typically a shorter financial history. But I'd also would say that raising the limit to $30 or $50 million, in our view, far outweighs any risk that would be presented. In job creation alone, it would be a significant step. I just would like to thank you for this opportunity to present information on such an important topic. I believe the proposed revision of Regulation A could make a real difference to small businesses and the entire economy, particularly its innovation sector. With that, I thank you and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Limpress, for your testimony. And next, the chair will recognize Mr. Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President and Co-Head of U.S. Listing and Cash Execution, New York Stock Exchange, Euronext. Mr. Cutler, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, members of the committee. I represent, as you said, NYSE Euronext, the world's leading and diverse exchange group with businesses in equities, futures, options, and markets throughout the United States and in Europe. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I applaud your strong commitment, even in the late days of this Congress, to promoting legislation that will help more American entrepreneurs access the capital that they need to expand their businesses and create jobs. Across America's economy today, small businesses are struggling to find capital. A record 41% of small business owners cannot get adequate financing, according to the most recent data of the National Small Business Association, up from 22% in 2008. Regulation A was adopted to address this very challenge, specifically to provide small businesses with the opportunity to access capital markets without incurring the expense or meeting the regulatory burden of full registration under the Securities Act of 1933. Increasing the SEC's Regulation A exemption from $5 million to $30 million would open the capital markets to more entrepreneurs, a vital step towards fueling America's most vigorous job creation machine. Oftentimes, the greatest acceleration in job growth occurs after a company's initial public offering. In fact, the National Venture Capital Association reports that 92% of all job growth within publicly traded companies occurs after the company's IPO. Consider a few examples. When Pixar released its first full-length movie, a little animated film called Toy Story, the company employed fewer than 100 people. Going public provided the financing for Pixar to grow from a small animator to a major motion picture studio. By the time the company released Toy Story 3 last summer, the number of jobs at Pixar alone had grown more than 8-fold. Another growing company, Vitamin Shoppe, went public last year in 2009. In the 9 months that followed, the company created nearly 300 new jobs and opened 29 new stores, the fastest expansion in its history. Congress has long recognized the benefit of helping small businesses secure capital through public offerings. Yet over the years, the Regulation A exemption has not been scaled to meet the demands of our modern economy. The $5 million exemption, which was last raised in 1980, is not indexed for inflation, is now too small to warrant companies incurring the time and expense to satisfy the offering and disclosure requirements of Regulation A. As a result, between 1995 and 2004, as others have said, on average only 8 companies per year utilize Regulation A. While some believe that Regulation D, which is the mechanism that most companies use for private placements, offers a viable means for small companies to raise capital, this provision has critical limitations. Regulation D offerings can only be made to a small group of qualified investors, and securities sold in such transactions are subject to transfer restrictions. A Regulation A offering, on the other hand, is a public offering, providing access to a large pool of investors. Raising the Regulation A exemption to $30 million seems to be a reasonable maximum, although most full registration IPOs today involve significantly higher offering minimums. Thus, this still leaves a gap between the $30 million ceiling and the level at which a company can realistically access the full registration IPO market. So in order to be effective, any modification of Regulation A must be implemented in a way that promotes capital raising by smaller companies while also protecting investors. This is why NYSE Euronext believes Congress should also direct the SEC to avoid imposing disclosure, governance, and other burdensome provisions that may actually increase costs and reduce the attractiveness of Regulation A. An exchange trading platform may have advantages for companies that issue securities and Regulation A offerings. Establishing a separate exchange trading platform may make these offerings more effective by providing some structural elements to improve liquidity, trading interests, and economics, as well as investor interest. However, we believe that further investigation would be required to determine if such platforms would be economically feasible. We believe all the relevant data point to one direction: entrepreneurs and small businesses cannot access the capital they need to grow and create jobs. And I urge you to revive Regulation A and dedicate it to the role Congress originally intended. Thank you again for allowing me to testify, and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler, and thanks to all of our witnesses, including Representative Anna Eshoo, for your testimony here today. And I would like to now begin my questions for Mr. Limpress. I appreciate the point you made on page 4 of your written statement that small growing companies need a variety of funding options, including equity-based financing, to compete and grow their businesses. Congress should continue doing all it can, as we have with legislation like the Small Business Jobs Act, enacted into law earlier this year, to empower small businesses and give them every opportunity to succeed and create jobs. On page 6 of your statement, sir, you indicate your support for increasing the Reg A threshold from $5 million to $30 million, and even a further increase up to $50 million. It seems to me like an increase to $30 million makes sense, but I think we should also make sure this increase is designed to help smaller issuers and not their mid-sized or larger competitors. Mr. Limpress, would you support legislation that raises the threshold to $30 million for now, but then require the SEC to review this threshold every 5 years or so? And if there's sufficient evidence to provide for a higher limit, they be given some flexibility to do so. Would you support that, sir?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. I don't think there's any magic in 30 million or 50 million, but I do think that we should be aware that the world is changing, and that there are companies now, as I mentioned earlier, particularly, for example, in the clean energy sector, sure, where it takes a great deal of capital to get going. We've got some wonderful ideas, again, not just in Silicon Valley, but around the country. And it's difficult to make sure those ideas are able to be fully funded. I think $30 million is a reasonable number. I think it's certainly more effective, and I think you'd see some real activity at that level.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hambrecht or Mr. Cutler, would you support providing the SEC with some flexibility on this threshold if they have strong evidence that raising it will benefit small issuers while not compromising oversight or adequate investor protections? Or does $30 million strike the right balance? Mr. Hambrecht, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I believe $30 million would allow companies to use it. The vast majority of companies that don't have access to the market, I think, could and would use the $30 million exemption. I might add, if I could, on the risk side of it, the one criticism of Reg A is that it doesn't require audited financials. And I think it would be important to have the SEC implement it with whatever else they think is necessary. And because virtually every company that raises money outside has audited numbers. So it really doesn't really mean anything. So I think applying a requirement for an audit would be a positive step along with the $30 million.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cutler, any comments?
Yes, we would also be supportive of that. I would note that becoming a public company is important because it provides permanent access to capital. And we noted earlier that most companies today are not able to access the public markets and access to permanent capital without raising 75 to 100 million. And so having a much lower threshold to be able to attract permanent capital in the public markets at 30 million is an adequate level. I would still note that still does create a gap between what is currently a standard IPO for most companies. And so I think we would be very supportive of that as well. Also supportive of what Bill had indicated, that the need for audited financials and disclosure to protect investors for these types of offerings is also important.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hambrack, on page 4 of your testimony, you lay out a rough estimate of about 750,000 jobs that could, in theory, be created by raising the Reg A limit to $30 million. Do you have any sense of how long it might take to create that many jobs through adjustments to Regulation A? And is there anything Congress can do to speed up job creation through these or other adjustments to Reg A?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that this Regulation A adjustment be made as soon as possible. Right now, every day you read more and more companies are being acquired. So I think it's a very real-time problem today that has to be adjusted. How long it will take to get going, it's hard to say. We've talked to literally dozens of companies that are very willing and able to move ahead as soon as this is implemented. I would hope that, basically the small cap market declined by about 4,000 companies over the last decade. So that says to me there probably should have been 4,000 IPOs over the last decade, which incidentally would be 400 a year, which is about equal to what it was in the 90s and the 80s. So to me, as soon as you can get it going, I would imagine, hard to imagine 500 offerings the first year, but I would be willing to bet it would happen over the next 3 to 4 years.
Thank you, sir. And I would like to ask the same question of the other gentleman, except my time has expired, and I would ask you if you have any comments on that to submit those in writing, please. The chair will next recognize Mr. Castle for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to try to take the conversation a little bit beyond some of the testimony and something that the chairman asked a moment ago that was the latter part of what he stated. But, all of us here, it's been stated by both opening statements and by Congresswoman Eshoo, we're all concerned about job creation. Obviously, the whole country is, members of Congress are. And my question to you is, beyond the changes in Regulation A, which you have discussed today, which seem to make sense to me, what could Congress do to enable our small companies to raise capital, which would allow them to expand and create jobs? Or what else would you recommend to Congress be doing in general for the creation of jobs and economic opportunity, perhaps even beyond the raising of capital? I ask that question to any one of you or all of you, if you're willing to take a shot at it.
One answer I can offer up relatively quickly and somewhat focused on the Regulation A issue that Mr. Hambrick mentioned is the concept of the blue sky laws are effective here, and that's something that is a burden for companies that are seeking to access capital, smaller companies. That should be addressed, it seems to me, as part of a look at Regulation A. I think more broadly, Congress should take a look at what is happening to our venture capital markets, what is happening to our innovation sector, it does not look the way it did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and there's much more being done overseas than there was. I think that some of that has to do with perhaps taking a look at the layers of regulations that have been added over the years to see if they're all still justified, because they do impose a burden, particularly on smaller companies as they begin to look to grow. But rather than provide an answer for you, unfortunately, what I can do is point out the issue and say I think it's an important one.
We agree with that, Mr. Cutler.
I would comment that when you look at the state of the capital markets, one has to have a global perspective. Today's capital markets are global. We have capital that's being created around the world, and more importantly, the companies that are created here in the United States that are employing hundreds of Americans are also competing globally. And so any regulation that we can do to enable companies access to capital in a way that's efficient and cost-effective, where the regulatory and the tax burdens are competitive with what these companies are competing up against around the world, would certainly go a long way towards fostering more job growth, creation, and innovation in our economy, and also help allow the United States to compete globally.
Thank you. Mr. Hambrick, any thoughts?
Well, I think anything, yeah, I know the Congress has been very active with the Small Business Act and have made more money available through the Small Business Act. My own personal belief is that if you really want companies to grow and be aggressive, you should allow them access to equity. Debt has to be paid back, and debt is something that controls growth and holds growth back. And I think the great companies that have arisen in Silicon Valley and elsewhere have largely done it with equity and have done it in equity markets. This was one of the great advantages we've had over the last 3 or 4 decades. And what we're trying to redress here is the fact that it isn't working right now for small companies. I wish I had some other ideas. I keep asking, and you know, somehow or other you have to get the IPO market going again. Congressman Eshoo asked me that. That's what led to this hearing. She said, "How do you get the IPO market going?" I said, "I don't know.
Well,
this is the only way I know."
If you have other ideas after you leave here, please feel free to write to the committee and suggest them. As I indicated, we're all looking for these opportunities, and it makes a difference. The other concern I have is that just listening to your testimony and the answer to your questions, while you are here to testify on behalf of $30 million, the concept of perhaps going higher than that is not something that you would object to. Is that correct? Do any of you feel there should be a cap on how high we should go?
You know, I think 50 million would be great. 30 million was arrived at by, that was the average size IPO in the 80s and the 90s that worked well, that worked for so many of these companies. The $100 million and above was a creation of the internet bubble that happened in the last 2 or 3 years of the 90s. So to me, 30 million would get us back to what used to be normal. You know, it certainly wouldn't hurt. It would help. It would add to the companies that use it, and they would have the same characteristics as the smaller companies. Yes.
Good. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his distinguished service and for his questions here. And the chair next recognizes Ms. Maloney of New York for 5 minutes.
Earlier, it was testified that the SEC could raise it if they saw fit, and due to the fact that we're still reeling from economic challenges and the financial crisis, what is the downside of doing this? Does the investor community support raising the offering or not? What is the protections for investors by exempting them from filing with the SEC?
May I answer?
Sure. Anybody.
I think, first of all, the addition of an audit requirement would go a long way towards answering any questions people have about added risk into the marketplace. In our testimony, we have some data that shows the historical performance of the small cap indexes in the market over the last 20 and 30 years. And while it's true that small cap markets are generally more volatile than larger ones, the performance has been as good as or better than large company investors. So there's plenty of people out there, plenty of institutions that run very aggressive and very professional investment funds in small cap companies. And I think the protections that they have now in terms of transparency and reporting requirements has worked well, and I don't see why you'd need any more.
Well, under the Dodd-Frank bill, I joined many of my colleagues in sponsoring an amendment that would exempt smaller companies under $75 million in market capitalization from the 404B independent auditor requirement, because the small businesses in my district were telling me that it was onerous. So to replace the filing with an auditor requirement, I think we would hear the same type of resistance from small businesses. They were telling me this is very costly. Now, could you explain exactly how Reg A works? It is merely filing with the SEC, correct? Why is that going to cost a company $2 million? Something's wrong with the filing requirements. If we're asking them to spend $2 million to file, we should look at that. And if you could explain exactly how it works and why is it so onerous that only 8 companies filed under Reg A?
Well, the basic
last year.
The first basic difference is that under Regulation A, you file an offering circular, not a prospectus. And there are some liability differences there, not major. And if you look at it, it looks just like a prospectus, except it doesn't have all the supporting data in the back, is about what it boils down to. One of the great frustrations of my career has been dealing with the legal and accounting costs of an IPO. You know, they just continue to multiply. It's a system that has scaled up along with the underwriters, and it's very difficult to fight. There's no reason in the world why you shouldn't be able to file a Regulation A almost without a lawyer.
And why do you think, and I'll ask all of you, companies are choosing not to list in the United States?
Companies that are domiciled in the United States are listing in the United States public markets. If they want to provide stock options to their employees, if they want to sell stock to U.S. investors, they have to list within the United States. So we're not actually seeing a trend of companies, entrepreneurial companies from the United States listing in foreign markets. We do continue to see a trend of non-domestic companies coming to the United States markets because of what they represent to the world: fair, transparent, deep, and liquid markets. And we want to continue to promote that opportunity that the United States capital markets continues to be competitive with other markets around the world. Today, the leading markets for initial public offerings are actually Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. New York Stock Exchange is number 2.
Your CEO, Mr. Cutler, recently said that this is the most robust IPO pipeline that we've seen in years, and I understand that companies are lining up to go public. Can you expand on this? What do you attribute this to?
We've seen in the last 2 months, in October and November, more capital raised in those 2 months than we had seen in all of 2009 and 2008. Or 2008. And so we see a very deep pipeline, and I think that's reflective of a recovery in the markets, recovery from the financial crisis, and it's global and across all industries. But I will still note that companies that are trying to raise capital below a $50 million amount, we're not seeing that.
Well, my time is over, and let's end with that positive statement that the capital markets are rebounding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. The chair next recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cutler, are there comparable limits on non-U.S. stock exchanges, other comparable to the $5 million limit?
What do you? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
On other stock exchanges, non-U.S. stock exchanges in other countries, are there comparable limits?
Well, there are opportunities in other countries that have smaller marketplaces that are less regulated. For example, we operate a marketplace in Europe called Alternex that has a sort of a non-registration element to it, which is accessible by companies raising $5 to $10 million.
I'm talking about the regulatory structure now. Are there on any of the other stock exchanges worldwide a comparable restrictions?
Yes, there are initial listing requirements, minimum thresholds in terms of the dollars amounts or market cap.
And what are they? I'm just trying to figure out how we are comparing to other countries.
Every exchange around the world in every country has those requirements. They all differ. The ones with the lowest standards would be those markets that you'd find in Shenzhen, London AIM, the Alternex market in Europe that are available for smaller.
And what are those limits? I mean, I'm just trying to. What's the range of the limits?
I'd have to get back to you with the exact details, but
okay, that's fine.
Very small companies are going public on those markets with below $50 million in market cap.
Okay, let me ask you to discuss, Mr. Hambrick, the interplay between Rule 506 of SEC Regulation D and what's happening here. I take it the whole reason for registration is to protect potential purchasers of stock, right? I mean, that's the rationale for it, and I'm sympathetic to job creation. I'm sympathetic to capital formation, capital raising, but what we don't want to do is compromise exposure of consumers. And Rule 506 at least has some protections there. Should we be expanding those the flexibility on the Rule 506 as opposed to raising this limit, or is that not an acceptable alternative?
I think, Regulation D basically regulates private placements. I'm sorry, but Regulation D basically regulates private placements. And as a result of a Regulation D filing, you do not get a public market afterwards. The stock is not freely tradable afterwards. This is the advantage of an IPO, and this is the process that leads a company to.
Okay, so I should be comparing this with other public offerings, not Rule D,
Exactly.
Regulation D.
I think
okay, all right,
I think
that's fine. All right, so then are there, you mentioned audits, an audit requirement you think ought to be one of the requirements, but then you turned around 2 or 3 sentences later and said you ought to be able to do this without even having a lawyer.
Right.
I'm a little perplexed about how you square those things now. You're not really serious about issuing a public offering of stock of any kind without the benefit of a lawyer, I assume. That was a little hyperbole, I take it.
Well, no, yes and no. You see, my philosophy has always been.
Let me ask a more direct question.
Okay.
What are the other, if you were expanding this from 5 million to 50 million or 30 million, what are the other things that you would want to impose to protect potential buyers, if any? You mentioned the audit requirement, but what are there other things that you would want as a precondition for doing that?
Well, yes. I think, first of all, the registration process now in place in the U.S. works well. There have been very few fraudulent IPOs in the United States. It's a good process. The reason I put the lawyer comment in is I've always felt it should be an investment document. It should be a document that gives the investor every fact that he should consider or want to consider before he makes his investment. That, to me, is the essence of a registration statement. And that's why they have to be done by the management and by the financial people, along with the lawyers, to make sure they comply with the law. But it has to be an investment document. That's the whole point of it. Because I think if the marketplace gets a complete information package, it will make good decisions. The market's pretty smart.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will next recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. McCarthy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of my questions have already been answered. And just going over some of the background that I had been reading last night, I guess the question I would like to ask all three of you is that if we do specific terms and conditions that should be imposed in connection with an increase in the offering limit, should Congress stipulate those terms, or should we be looking at those terms and conditions and leave them to the SEC? Which basically would work out better, and what are the drawbacks and what are the positive aspects on Congress or the SEC?
I can tell you from my standpoint, the imposition of terms and conditions, I think, is the kind of thing a regulatory agency, the SEC, is better positioned to do for a number of reasons. One would be they've got greater flexibility. They can go through a regulatory reform process, issuing proposed rules, taking comments from the public, and adjusting more readily than Congress can. And I think that's the kind of, for the most part, the kind of detail that is appropriately left to the regulators. I think the SEC generally handles those kinds of things quite well. Having said that, what I would say is there is an important role for Congress, and I think it's shown simply by the state of Regulation A today, because the SEC does have the ability to take the kinds of actions that we've been talking about and has chosen not to. And I think it's very important for Congress to say, hey, this is an important thing, and to provide the impetus to get it going. But I do believe the SEC's got real expertise that should be tapped.
Do you think that then the SEC would need more resources to basically go forward with that?
I can't tell you off the top of my head that the answer is yes. My gut is probably not, but I think that one of the problems, we're measuring it against something that doesn't exist now because Regulation A filings are essentially not occurring, so they're not applying resources to them today. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it'd be any substantial increase in resources.
And being that there's a little bit time left, which usually never happens, is there anything that was in your testimony that you couldn't talk about that you would want to bring out in front now? Great.
I would just add one addition to the SEC. In the 90s, the SEC would process 500-600 S1 registration statements a year. Now that they're under 100. I know they're doing a lot of other things because of the financial crisis, but a Regulation A registration is much simpler. It has a 28-day reporting requirement back, and it used to work pretty well. They used to actually do them in their regional offices. I don't know if they would do that now, but it's less of a burden than a lot more S1s.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank the gentlelady, and the chair next recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Mr. Castle as well for his leadership here, and I want to thank our witnesses for helping us with this work. I tend to think that the lack of applications or interest in this is more to do with the economy than some of the limitations at the current time. But I'm with you. I believe that this is something that has not been changed since 1980, and I think that an increase is certainly a reasonable request. I'm not so sure that 30 million is the number. But I am concerned about the fact that we're now going to open this up to unsophisticated investors. And while I know that in your testimony you mentioned companies like Pixar and Twitter and Facebook, there are also a lot of dogs out there that probably weren't thoroughly vetted and yet were launched. And so I'm concerned about the consumer protection angle of this. I think we can strike a balance, however. Let me ask you, have you actually reached out to the SEC, given the new responsibilities that we're giving them under the Dodd-Frank Act? Have you asked them about concerns they might have in terms of raising this exemption from $5 million to $30 million?
Chairman, or Congressman, what I would comment about that is if you look at the requirements of the offering circular under Regulation A, there's a section in there that requires the issuer to identify risks associated with the offering, which are very similar requirements that you would see in a S1 full registration statement. So the similar sort of identification of risks to the offering, risks to the issuer would be required in an offering circular under Regulation A, as you do have under a full registration statement. So I think when we talk about additional risk to investors, I don't think that we're adding any more risk than a regular public offering, which also discloses risk factors of the company. The only thing you're introducing is earlier stage companies, which by their nature are more risky investments by themselves as a class. but the adequacy of the disclosure around the risk factors is actually required in their offering circulator already under Regulation A.
Right. I mean, you're getting to my point. The newness, the lack of financial history here, often makes these companies a real gamble. And I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way that in addition to the audited financials that you mentioned earlier, I think that's a great suggestion. Are there other precautions that we might take proactively to say, okay, we are going to lift this limit. However, here are some additional safeguards so that we don't end up with, folks really going into this completely in the dark. That there's, it almost asks for some type of, not a rating agency, but some type of vetting process, given the larger amount that we're authorizing here under the exemption.
The problem that I've always seen from trying to quantify the risk is, or set of standards, which a lot of countries do. A lot of countries will have certain numerical standards for companies in terms of operating income and history and everything else. It's difficult, very, very difficult to do that in an economy that has moved as fast as the technology world has.
Certainly.
So, to me, the answer has always been transparency. The answer has always been a absolute commitment to presenting every fact you have and everything you can about that company. And I find that the investors generally make pretty good decisions. The latest financial crisis really has had nothing to do with really small consumers. It was really markets that lack transparency, dealer markets, and a lack of information, and frankly, as you know, poor rating agencies.
Yeah.
So
let me just close by saying I appreciate those remarks. I think you help your cause very much by having Congresswoman Eshoo speak on your behalf. I think the fact that she came forward today, she has a lot of credibility with the people on this committee on both sides of the aisle, and I think you were very well served by having her speak on your behalf. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. The chair next recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much. We've heard a lot of very good information in the question and answer period. I think now, though, we might want to examine what do we do now, and how do we craft the proper legislative vehicle to move forward. Do we language it in such a way as we authorize the SEC to raise this limit, or do we require them to do it? And the history of the SEC and the Securities Act of 1933, that language was not clear. They, at one point when we changed it last, I think about 1992, it took them a while before they actually implemented it. So I'd like to get your thoughts, each of your thoughts on, I think we all agree this is great, we're going to do it, but it's up to us now to craft the best legislative vehicle to get the job done. So what would be your recommendations there, particularly on the language of whether we authorize them to do it or we require them to?
In my view, sir, the ideal solution would be a mandate from Congress to do it, to set that figure. I do like the idea of revisiting it periodically and deferring to SEC the terms and conditions. I also think, however, that through oversight and other means, Congress should keep an eye on those terms and conditions, because oftentimes the layering of very well-intentioned individual regulatory obligations can undercut a legislative goal. So in this case, what I would urge is that Congress mandates the higher limit and permits the SEC to set the terms and conditions, would be my view.
All right. Mr. Humbert?
I would agree with that. I have great respect for the SEC. They're a fine regulatory body. I do think, though, that there's some time pressures here, and that everybody would like to see this get going quickly. I think if the SEC has a rule change, they have to go through a process that could take some time. And I would think a congressional mandate could move it quickly, and then definitely leave the SEC to implement it and to change whatever they see fit to change to make sure that they live up to their regulatory responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say this is an opportunity to address a economic and political challenge, and that is creating a job growth opportunity engine. And the opportunity of the committee here is to recognize the role of the public markets in the creation of jobs and mandating a part of a solution to encourage more efficient and more accessible public markets, and then leaving the discretion with the SEC in terms of how that is implemented. But the opportunity to act now, I think, is real.
All right. How deep do you think Congress should go in this? Do you think we should stipulate terms and conditions such as a requirement for audited financials?
I would leave that up to the SEC, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be beneficial. I would think that their natural reaction would be to do it that way. But they've dealt with Sarbanes. They've dealt with all the accounting issues. I would leave it to them.
So, in other words, what you're saying, all of you, is that we should craft this legislation. We should mandate that they do it, but we should leave the discretion up to them in terms of the specific particulars.
The only caveat I would add, Congressman, is the fact that we should be promoting investor protection, but at the same time avoiding imposing disclosure and increased governance or burdensome provisions that would actually increase the costs of the application of Regulation A as it currently stands. That would be the only risk.
And then finally, just for your opinions, do you feel that $30 million is the adequate figure we need? I mean, you have a chance here to make a statement on whether or not each of you feel this is the right number, or is there any feeling among you that it needs to be larger?
Because as I have said, Congressman, from our standpoint, the $30 million figure is a workable figure, but we believe, or I believe, $50 million would be a better figure. It would provide sufficient resources to startups, particularly startups in the innovation industry that sometimes are quite capital intensive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I thank the gentleman for his questions. And the chair, I've just been advised that there will be votes called between 11:30 and 11:45, so we want to move right along here, and we have time, I think, to give the two additional members time to ask their questions. The chair next recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Klein. Sir, you recognized for 5 minutes? I'm sorry? Okay. The chair will next recognize Mr. Foster. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Is there a best method for indexing this limit? Is it simple inflation, total market capitalization, so you don't have to revisit this every decade or two?
I personally don't think it's a question of inflation. It's much more a product of consolidation and of a change in the makeup of the distribution mechanism for equity. So.
But still, what, $5 million was set in 1980, if I remember right? Yeah. So simple inflation, you'd be up near between 10 and 15, which would at least do something for you.
But the problem with that is that it still would not get you to a large enough offering to allow you for the blue sky exemption and the exchange-based listing. So you would still have the same problem of having a limited aftermarket, and it would help on the expenses, sure. Yeah. But you would have the limited aftermarket.
My next question is about the alternext exchange and that sort of approach. Has it been tried and failed in the U.S.? Is it successful at providing an alternate exit route for startups and so on?
In the United States, we have not had a regulation light exchange platform. That is an exchange platform that would allow companies to sell to public investors in a lightly regulated fashion that exists in other markets around the world. I mentioned both the AIM marketplace in London as well as our marketplace, Alternext, which is really only applicable to the smallest of issuers. And in some instances, they're actually regulated or overseen by the by representatives who represent.
Well, my question is that an effective exit route for startups or not? What's wrong with that? Or is that what you anticipate would happen if we raised it to 50 million? That there would be, a much more active market here, or what is the change, if any, that you anticipate in the structure of things?
It essentially enables smaller companies access to the public markets. So as a public offering, where today they don't have a similar access. That's the big change.
If I may add, for example, the AIM market has been looked on as an example of regulation light opening for small companies. And it's interesting, the performance of the AIM, and they've had, I believe, about 1,800 listings in the UK. The performance to the investor has been not statistically different than the London Stock Exchange. Pretty much the same.
Yeah. Well, let's see, the business of testing the waters, what is the argument against that for very large IPOs? I mean, is that something where there's sort of an insider abuse thing that people are worried about? And could that morph into existence if you raised it up to 50?
Traditionally, the SEC used to be very sensitive to any pre-filing publicity. They still are. The rules are against it because they didn't want, in effect, companies out there promoting their stock before a registration statement was available to investors. So the whole point was there's a quiet period where you're not allowed to talk. To be candid, most companies now try to read the market somewhat before moving ahead, but do it through investor relations firms, not underwriters. So it's happening anyway. And I think the Reg A rule is actually a very practical rule. It allows you to go out and talk to a small group of people. Or,
So you don't think we should be worried about some sort of abuses as that threshold goes up?
Well, I would say, to be candid, it's being used in most S1 registration statements now, probably to the advantage of both parties.
Okay. And I guess just one last question. It's sort of my impression, without having studied it, the whole malaise in the VC industry has to do with the fact that there are not that many great investments, and the overall return on investment has not been that great for the last decade. And is that just my impression, or is there some element of truth to that that's really driving a lot of the, the difficulty in raising money here?
I would say that this is not related to venture returns, although that statement would be true. This is more about access to permanent capital in the public markets than it is related to how is it that we can help the venture capital industry.
Yeah, well, exiting is very relevant, right? And so
an exit does provide liquidity for the initial investors, but probably more importantly to this discussion, creates access to the long-term permanent capital as a public company for the issuer to enable to reinvest in the business, hire more people, expand operations.
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and the chair notes that some members may have additional questions for this panel, which they may submit in writing. Without objection, the hearing and record will remain open for 30 days for members to submit written questions to these witnesses and to place their responses in the record. The chair thanks the witnesses for their appearance today before this committee and for their answering our questions. This hearing is adjourned.